was never the kind to believe in ghosts, demons, or anything paranormal, but after what I experienced, I don't think I'll ever see the world the same way again. I was a cop, a logical guy who dealt with facts and evidence. I'd seen a lot in my time, things that didn't always add up, sure, but nothing that ever shook my belief in what's real, until that night. The report was straightforward, a noise complaint in a quiet neighborhood. Midnight had come and gone, and every house on the street was dark. The streets were silent as my partner and I arrived. Let's call him Paul, and I'll go by Mike. We parked, stepped out, and made our way to the front door of the house. It was eerily quiet as we knocked, announcing, "Police. Is anyone home?" A little girl opened the door, a kid, maybe 8 or 9, looking out at us with wide eyes. I knelt down. "Hey, are your parents home?" She shook her head slowly. I figured she'd probably just turned the TV too loud, maybe startled a neighbor with late-night cartoons. But as I was about to tell her to lock up and go back inside, we heard it. Silverware crashing to the floor from somewhere deep in the house. I glanced at Paul. A child alone in a dark house with that kind of noise. It was enough to treat as an intruder situation. I asked the girl to step outside, handing her over to Paul. "Paul, maybe you can give her one of those lollipops you always keep around," I said, trying to lighten the mood. Paul gave me a look but handed her a lollipop as she giggled. I turned back, slowly pushing the door open. "Police, if anyone's in here, make yourself known." The darkness pressed in on all sides, and there was nothing. No one moved in the shadows, and no sound followed. The place was dead quiet, almost like the house itself was holding its breath. I turned back to the little girl. "I'm Officer Mike," I said gently. "What's your name?" "Maribel," she replied in a quiet voice. Just as she answered, the silence shattered. The television in the living room flicked on, blasting static at full volume, startling me and Paul. We quickly moved Maribel to the back seat of our patrol car, thinking she'd be safest there. We returned to the house, hesitant but compelled, flicking on light switches as we went, but none of them worked. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught something. A shadowy figure in the mirror. I glanced back, expecting to see Paul, but he wasn't there. It was just me staring at my own uneasy reflection. Then we heard it. The sound of running footsteps, fast and furious, coming right toward us. We drew our firearms, pointing them toward the source, but no one appeared. The footsteps grew louder, closer, as objects flew from shelves, chairs tumbled to the floor, lamps smashed to pieces around us. The footsteps reached us, but there was no one there. We bolted out the front door, stumbling onto the lawn, hearts racing as the footsteps stopped just at the threshold. But then, our police siren blared on. Startled, I ran to turn it off, glancing back at Paul, who looked pale and shaken. "You all right, Paul?" I asked. He unwrapped a lollipop with trembling hands and nodded. "Yep." Opening the back door, I checked on Maribel, asking if she was okay. She nodded, but something in her gaze was distant, like she was somewhere else entirely. Paul pulled me aside, his voice low and tense. "Mike, did you notice something off about this house?" "What do you mean?" He gestured toward the family photos hanging on the walls. "She's not in any of them." My stomach twisted. I looked at the photos again, and sure enough, not a single one included Maribel. "Are you saying..." "What, that Maribel is haunted?" I stammered, half joking, but hoping he'd say something reasonable. "Mike, how else do you explain what just happened? The TV turns on the moment she steps outside. Figures in the mirror, invisible footsteps running us down. There's something here, and I don't think it wants us here." A heavy silence fell between us, broken only when Paul started back toward the house. "I need to check the mirrors," he muttered. Reluctantly, I followed. Paul picked up a book from the counter and smashed the nearest mirror, handing me a shard. "It only shows up in reflections," he said, voice steady but his eyes betraying his fear. We swept our flashlights through the rooms, mirrors in hand, praying we wouldn't see anything. But suddenly, in the broken glass, I saw it, a skeletal figure with red, bony arms. I stumbled back as its claw tore through my uniform, searing pain tearing through my back. My grip on the glass splintered as I fell forward. Paul fired a shot, and the screeching echo of whatever it was faded away. He helped me up, and we both staggered outside, breaths coming in ragged gasps. But when we reached the car, Maribel was gone. It was impossible to explain any of it. The cameras we'd hoped would back up our story were dead. Not a single frame to prove what we'd seen. But the captain's expression changed when we mentioned Maribel. He pulled out an old missing persons report and showed us a picture. There, staring back at us, was the girl from that house, Maribel. She'd been missing for years. I gave up my badge a few days later, along with whatever pride I could still muster. So if anyone is listening, if you ever hear footsteps when no one's there, or doors opening on their own, just remember, there might be someone or something that's trying to get in. I took the job because it was the only one that would have me. Security work at an abandoned warehouse, graveyard shift. It sounded simple enough. Clock in, stay awake, clock out. Easy money, they said. On the first night, I pulled up to the warehouse, its silhouette looming under a half-lit moon. "Keep the place secure," the supervisor had told me, handing me a flashlight. "You're all alone here, so keep your eyes open, and if you hear anything, just ignore it." I shrugged it off as a bad joke, but the warning lingered as I stepped into the darkness. Inside, the warehouse was a hollowed-out shell, rows of empty shelves stretching in every direction. Silence hung heavy, broken only by the echo of my footsteps. Halfway through my shift, I heard it. A soft scraping sound coming from somewhere in the warehouse's depths. I stopped, the beam of my flashlight trembling against the shadows. I knew I should ignore it, just like they'd said, but curiosity got the better of me. I moved slowly toward the sound, my pulse drumming in my ears. The scraping grew louder as I approached the far corner of the building, where a broken set of shelves leaned against the wall. And then I saw it. Or rather, him. A figure standing there in the dark, just at the edge of my flashlight's beam. His back was turned to me, his posture hunched and strange. His hands were scratching the wall, tracing letters that I couldn't make out. "Hey!" I called out, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "You're not supposed to be here." The figure froze, his hand dropping to his side. For a long moment he stood there, unmoving. Then in one slow, deliberate motion he turned to face me. His face was obscured by shadows, but his eyes, they glowed, faint and red, like dying embers in the night. A chill ran down my spine as he took a step toward me. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. The flashlight slipped from my grasp, rolling across the concrete floor. By the time I snatched it back up, the figure was gone. I spun around, scanning the warehouse with a desperate, frantic light. But there was nothing. Just empty shelves and silence. The rest of the shift passed in a blur, the minutes dragging like hours. Every creak, every whisper of wind outside felt like his footsteps. But he never returned. When my relief finally arrived at dawn, I bolted out of there without a word. The second night was worse. The scratching started the moment I stepped through the door, echoing from every corner of the warehouse. I tried to ignore it, keep my mind on anything else, but it was impossible. The scratching was everywhere, closing in, crawling under my skin. And then I saw the writing. It was scrawled all over the walls in jagged letters carved deep into the concrete. Leave, leave, leave. But I couldn't. Not if I wanted to keep this job. The third night I came prepared. I brought a recorder, determined to capture proof of whatever was going on. Maybe then they'd believe me. Maybe then they'd do something. As I hit record and waited in the darkness, the scratching returned, louder than ever. But this time there was something else. A voice whispering just barely audible beneath the scraping. Please, help me. The voice was faint, broken, desperate. I followed the sound to the corner of the warehouse where the shelves loomed like shadows in the dark. And there, scratched into the floor, were the words, "He's still here." I stumbled back, my breath hitching in my chest. The words blurred as a figure appeared in front of me, close enough that I could feel the cold seeping from his skin. The same man, his eyes burning red, his hand reaching out. I turned and ran, tearing through the darkness until I burst out into the cool night air, gasping for breath. I quit the next day. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear it, the scratching, the whisper begging me to come back, because he's still there, and I know he's waiting for me. The first time I noticed the window, it was 2:47 a.m. I remember the exact time because I was awake for no reason, staring at the glow of my phone, desperate for something to help me drift off. I tossed it aside, turned over, and that's when I saw it. A small, rectangular window across from my bed, slightly ajar. But it was impossible. My bedroom didn't have a window on that wall. I blinked hard, convinced it was some sort of half-dream. But when I opened my eyes again, the window was still there. Pale, cool moonlight filtered through, casting an eerie glow over the room. I got up slowly, as if my legs might betray me at any second, and inched my way toward it. As I got closer, a chill settled over me. I could see movement in the darkness beyond, shapes shifting just out of sight. The shadows melted together, stretching and merging until I could almost make out figures. People, maybe, standing silently on the other side of the glass, watching me. I slammed the window shut. It disappeared instantly, leaving nothing but a blank wall. I told myself it was just a sleep-deprived hallucination. But every night for the next week, the window appeared at exactly 2:47 a.m. Sometimes I ignored it, refusing to look in its direction, hoping that if I just lay there with my eyes shut, it would disappear. But sometimes curiosity got the better of me. Each night the shadows grew clearer, more defined. It wasn't my imagination. There were people there, 5 or 6 of them, all staring back at me, unmoving. On the 7th night, I made a choice that I still regret. When the window appeared, I didn't just look through it, I opened it. As soon as I did, the figures stepped forward, revealing their faces. They were pale, lifeless, with hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. One of them, a tall woman with long, dark hair, leaned forward, close enough for me to feel her cold breath on my face. "We've been waiting for you," she whispered. I stumbled back, slamming the window shut. It vanished again, leaving only the familiar blank wall. I stayed up the rest of the night, watching the wall like a hawk, terrified it would appear again. But it didn't. I thought it was over until the next night, when the window appeared in a new place, the living room wall. My stomach dropped. It was earlier this time, just after sunset. The people were there again, watching, but now there were more of them. I counted 8, maybe 9 shadowy figures crowded against the glass, their eyes fixed on me, and the woman's voice echoed in my mind. "We've been waiting for you." I moved out of my apartment the next day. I didn't tell anyone why, just packed up what I could fit in my car and drove 3 states over, renting the first available place I could find. For a while it seemed like everything was fine. I slept peacefully, free from the nightmare of the window. Until last night. As I sat on the couch in my new apartment, I caught a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I turned slowly, heart pounding. There, in the middle of the living room wall, was the window. And this time, the figures weren't just standing on the other side. They were stepping through. This story took place in the late 1970s. My grandmother and her sister were only about 10 years old when they moved to Danville, Illinois, with their mother, who had recently become a single parent after losing her husband. Life had been tough, but they were managing until their mother was jailed for child abuse just a month after the move. With nowhere else to go, my grandmother and her sister were sent to live on the campus of a strict Catholic boarding school. The school itself was imposing, with newly rebuilt structures after the old ones were found to have toxic levels of lead paint. During the renovation, the builders had sealed small cellars under each room. These cellars had entrances hidden beneath trapdoors, which were now covered by fresh tile floors. The sealed rooms beneath seemed to have been forgotten, or so it seemed. One night during sleep time, my grandmother's sister was jolted awake by distant, eerie screams, muffled as though coming from beneath the floor. She tried to tell the priest in charge, but he dismissed it as a problem with mice or other animals. But she was convinced there was something human about the sounds she'd heard. Months passed, and they tried to adjust to life at the school. When my grandmother turned 12, she was moved to the other side of the campus, away from her sister. They could only see each other during study time, a brief 20 minutes each day. It wasn't enough, and she missed her terribly. One night, determined to spend more time with her sister, my grandmother sneaked back to her old dorm. But when she arrived, her sister's bed was empty. The next day, her sister was still nowhere to be found, even during study time. Thinking she must be in detention, my grandmother tried to wait it out, but days went by, and there was still no sign of her. Finally, she went to the principal, asking if her sister had been moved without her knowing. He just looked at her, confused, and acted as though he didn't remember her sister at all, insisting she must have been mistaken. Then one night, my grandmother heard it too, the unmistakable sound of someone screaming beneath the floor. It brought back everything her sister had described months earlier, and she lay frozen in bed, not knowing what to do. Just as she was trying to gather the courage to find help, the principal suddenly barged in and told her she could return to her old dorm. She quickly agreed, hoping to find comfort with her old friends and to escape the unsettling sounds that had filled her room. The next morning, there was commotion in the old dormitory. Police had arrived, and a section of the floor had been torn up, revealing a trap door just where her sister's bed had been. When my grandmother asked one of the officers what was inside, he told her to step back, that it wasn't safe for her to be there. Later that day, they found her sister in that hidden basement. She had been trapped for days, alone, but thankfully, she hadn't been harmed. She was shaken and weak, showing signs of a struggle, but she was alive. The principal and the head priest of the school were arrested for child abuse and suspected in the disappearances of other children who had vanished from the school over the years. Though her sister recovered in time, she could never return to her old beliefs. She had seen something in that basement, a darkness that changed her forever. She grew up to live her life without faith, turning away from the very institutions that had once promised her safety.